And just back from Copenhagen himself, after spending a full 2 weeks at the climate conference, Andrew Light is with us once again. He's a senior fellow with the Center for American Progress. Great to have you with us again, Andrew.
Good to be back, Tyler.
Been on the ground, I know, for about 24 hours so far.
Less than that, I think. Yeah.
You said in your initial assessment of the outcome, Andrew, that the outcome is complicated. Now, yesterday we were talking to Jonathan Lash from WRI. He gave it a B+. Can you assign it a grade level?
I think Jonathan's probably right. I'd say B+. You know, coming into this again, we never really thought we were getting a fully final ratifiable legal agreement. We thought it would be an interim agreement. It would have been better if we had a secure deadline on the interim agreement so that we knew that there was a fuse on it, that at 2010 Mexico City, this had to be transformed into a new legally binding agreement or we move on and try something else.
One of the things that Jonathan mentioned, Andrew, and speaking for the green community, I think as a whole, was the fact that the outcome is much more welcome, given the fact that everyone was so close to leaving town with nothing concrete in hand.
Absolutely. And if you look at the final vote on Saturday, as we sort of like went and really after all night, the late night, you know, up all night there, it came down to really only 5 countries objecting and saying they were not willing to sign on to this and therefore make it a binding political agreement under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. You had 188 countries say they're ready to go forward and work on this. And I think that's enough, in fact, to go ahead and begin the process of using the framework of the Accord to structure emissions negotiations into 2010.
Now, dealing with those somewhat rogue nations, Andrew, I'd like to read a quote that you had in one of your most recent analysis of the issues in Copenhagen. And to read it back to you, you said, "The architecture for commitments for the Copenhagen Accord is essentially the Australian schedule approach." And you went on to say, "This is a big win for us." And looking at those words, first of all, talk about the Australian approach and why it is such a big victory.
Well, the Australian approach, which also South Korea had a version of, is called a registry or a schedule approach, and it basically says that rather than having an international agreement that only focuses on economy-wide measures like a cap-and-trade program, for example, could deliver in looking at what a country can contribute to reducing emissions, that you should let countries really sort of make a list of everything they're willing to do economy-wide and also the smaller sectoral things. So, for example, in the US, the 5% set-aside in Waxman-Markey just for international forestry. And you should add all those up together, and that should be what a country contributes. And what this does is it actually allows countries like the United States, which can't immediately go to an economy-wide measure that is as ambitious as, say, the EU's economy-wide targets by 2020, to really throw in some more things that will actually start to approach some kind of parity among numbers. And in fact, that's what the Copenhagen Accord does. It actually asks each country that's going to sign on to it to submit a registry or a schedule by the end of this January, so just in a little over a month, of what measures altogether they're willing to put forward in order to reduce emissions. And then we'll see how close we are to holding emissions so that you don't get any more than a 2-degree rise in temperature you know, by the end of the century.
Well, let's talk about the Accord itself, not so much the substance of what it does and doesn't do, but rather the significance of it, not in the big picture politically, but rather what it means as a building block toward Mexico City next year.
I mean, what it means is you have got definitely something on the table. You've got a way in which developed and developing countries can now reach across and start working together. The game changer in this is that the Copenhagen Accord, as opposed to the Kyoto Protocol, really, in terms of looking at the process for getting it, is dividing the world no longer just between developed and developing countries, but major emitters and everyone else. What's going to make the most difference by the end of January is to see if you can get the 17 to 20 largest emitters in the world to submit schedules of what they're willing to do. And that should hopefully get us where we need to be by 2020.
Well, is developed versus developing somewhat of a false choice now, given who falls in which category? Absolutely. And the success potentially of the Copenhagen Accord with these major emitters, Brazil, India, China, that are technically developing still economically? That's
precisely right. I think that we're now taking a big step away from developing as being really the name of the game at these UN meetings, I hope. And you can really see this the way that President Obama on Friday, when he held his press conference announcing this big breakthrough, even though there are 27 countries at the table working on this accord, he singled out Brazil, India, China, South Africa for the major emitters in the developing world as really the key countries to making this happen. So this was presented as a package among those developing emitters and the United States.
Does this further marginalize the ocean states, for lack of a better term, I think especially of Tuvalu, who held up the proceedings for almost an entire day during the first week?
Right.
Are they going to be further marginalized, Andrew, and have to make more of a ruckus to get anything accomplished in these international meetings?
Tuvalu got a big win out of this, even with the Copenhagen Accord, because it's the first international climate agreement document which says not only should we look at holding temperature increases to 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, but we should consider a framework for holding it to 1.5, which is exactly what they wanted. And then secondly, in terms of the small island nations, the president of the Maldives, the prime minister of the Maldives, signed on to this agreement, the Copenhagen Accord, as the main representative of the Association of Small Island Nations.
Would you agree that in some senses, coming away without a legally binding agreement isn't as damaging objectively as it seems, because countries, even with a legally binding agreement, are going to do as they see fit. What's best for their economies individually.
That's right, and that's been a familiar refrain from people who have sort of pushed back against the cry for a legally binding agreement. I mean, will, for example, Canada have any repercussions, even though it's never going to meet its Kyoto Protocol commitment? It doesn't look like it. But I still think that we need to move forward to some kind of legally binding agreement, at least in terms of how we look at verification, these sorts of things. That should still be our aspiration in 2010, though we do have a framework to move forward even in the absence of it, and that's a good thing.
I'm curious about a recent point you made, Andrew, in your most recent article, which you said any weakness regarding the Copenhagen Accord should be blamed on process and not politics. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
What I said was process, not parties.
Not parties.
So, exactly right. So we started the week out at Copenhagen with different countries pointing the finger and saying, it's your fault, we're not going to get a legally binding agreement, it's your fault, it's this fault, it's that fault.
Which sounds a lot like politics to me, frankly.
Exactly. And exactly, politics internationally is the same as it is domestically. We ended the meeting with pretty much a very similar kind of people pointing the finger, not quite so much, but still finger pointing. I think the problem is the process. Fundamentally, here's the problem. We've got a consensus process in the UN Framework Convention. All 192 countries have to agree on moving forward, even if it's only a political agreement, even if it's not a legally binding agreement. And so holdouts, oil states like Venezuela and the Sudan, can hold this meeting hostage. The question is, when it comes to just carbon mitigation, not things like adaptation, but just carbon mitigation, where you don't need Venezuela to really make a contribution to lower their emissions to get where you need to go, could we possibly come up with an alternative process whereby we get just those largest emitters to agree to where they're going to go, developed and developing, and therefore get on the track we need to go by 2020, by 2050 to hold emissions down to where we need them to be? It might be that that a process which allows a party, no matter how contrarian, to hold it up is really not optimal for getting that kind of agreement.
Do you agree with the latest EU pitch that the pressure is squarely on the United States? We agreed to some form of emissions cuts, even though there is no legislation that has passed yet. There's only the threat of regulation. Right. So you agree with all the pressure being on the U.S., maybe more so than ever, to put emissions cuts together? Well,
I think that's where we are now. I mean, I think what the EU said today, the part of it that I completely agreed with is that the pressure is now on, and this is significant. People need to understand that the fact that President Obama went there himself really put his own credibility on the line. I mean, went into meetings, interrupted things, shook things up, reached across the table, made sure the deal got made insofar as a deal did get made, did get made, means that he's got to deliver to the international community now with getting climate legislation here in the U.S.
Final question, Andrew. When you look at the bill that will be out there, in addition to Waxman-Markey, the Kerry, Lieberman-Graham bill we're expecting in the Senate, are these emissions cuts too low? The rest of the world seems very clear that it's not enough, and put in 1990 levels, we're looking at, what, a 3% cut by 2020?
That's right, but if you add in things like the forestry provisions that are in Waxman-Markey, then you get a minimum of 11% cuts below 1990 by 2020. This is some work that we did with Project Catalyst to sort of to determine that figure. So in fact, it actually is better than it appears. But more importantly, the U.S. position is that they can catch up. They may not be where the EU is, for example, in 2020, but they claim that by 2025, by 2030, they're going to get to something like 40% cuts below 2005, so that by 2050, they will have made the same emissions reductions as the other major parties.
You sound optimistic.
I still am optimistic. I'm tired after 2 weeks of this. We all are.
Sure.
But after a pause, after the long flight home, I'm really seeing a pathway forward through 2010 and how we can make this work.
Andrew Light is a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress, becoming a regular analyst with us on international climate issues. Andrew, it's great to have you back with us, and welcome home once again.
Thank you, Tyler.
We appreciate it. Thank you.